Let's talk about some of the changes that a person might experience psychosocially after a traumatic brain injury. Um, Social cues are something that we all kind of take for granted and use all the time and don't even really think about. But when you have trouble understanding other people's social cues or using them, it can be really difficult. A social cue might be, just for an example, looking at your watch when you're in a hurry or need to go or end a conversation. It might be looking at the door when you're expecting someone else to come in. For a student, a social cue might be a teacher turns off the lights when everyone in the classroom is supposed to be quiet. So, some simple things to do for someone who has trouble with social cues would be to be really concrete and specific in what you're trying to communicate. So, for that teacher, everybody's going to be quiet now. We're going to have a quiet time. Um, Doing that along with turning off the lights can really help to make that a really solid communication for everybody in the classroom too. For adults, having a meeting and saying, I only have 1 hour and I've got to go at this time, but I'd love to catch up with you later, or we'll do a follow up. We'll send everybody notes when we're done. Having that agreed on plan is not just helpful to that person. It helps everybody else know, when they need to go. Um, Dealing with an overstimulating environment. Now, I think that's one where I would really recommend the use of the symptom tracker. There's another video in this series where we talk about how to use it, but basically it's just a really great way to keep track of symptoms, what causes them, what's going on at the time, how you dealt with them, and if it worked or not. And then after you get that information, you start to see what can improve the situation. So an overstimulating environment might be for a person, for an adult in the workplace, a busy office with people coming and going, meetings in different rooms, somebody maybe in the next office on a really loud conference call. And when you're overstimulated by that, it's so hard to be productive and to focus on what you're doing. A good way to deal with that could just be putting a note on the door in a meeting, on a call, just closing out some of that noise and closing out some of those interruptions so people can understand what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that you'll be available in another hour, or you'll be available when you're finished with that. In the experience for students in maybe a busy, crowded cafeteria, they could have lunch in another place. They could sit in a quieter section of the cafeteria, have lunch at a slightly different time. There are easy ways to make some changes for that student to have an easier time with that. Emotional ability. So that is when a person has an unexpected and inappropriate for the circumstance emotional expression. So they're crying when something's funny or happy. They're laughing when they're at a funeral. When something's really sad or serious, it's just completely the opposite of what you expect. I think one of the very best things to do with that situation is to acknowledge it very briefly. This is part of the injury. I don't mean to do that. Let's just get back to what we were doing. It can really help to make people understand a little more what's going on and realize they don't need to also have a big reaction to that emotion that's being expressed. It helps sort of deflect the situation and move on to something else. When someone has a lack of awareness of their deficits, whether that's a lack of awareness of a physical change that they may have experienced, a need for assistance in the classroom or socially, really all areas of your life can be affected by brain injury. But when someone doesn't understand how affected they are or how many different types of deficits they have, that can be really hard. Helping somebody with what you can see that they need help with and pointing it out in a very gentle way, in a way that you would like to be spoken to if it were you, can go a long way. I see you're having trouble with this. Let me do this with this. Be helpful. Um, is really a nice way to help somebody who might not realize they can't quite do what they were doing before. Depression and anger, it makes a lot of sense that if somebody didn't have an injury, they've acquired a disability, and they're dealing with a whole new way of doing things, might be really upset about that. It's only common sense. Um, it's only fair that they would be able to experience that feeling and for other people to understand it. I think what we sometimes forget is that not just adults, but even kids can be depressed. Even kids can have that anger and that frustration of knowing that they could do something before and now they can't. And there's a bit of, I think there's a bit of grief and loss in dealing with that change. And then they can have the chance to create some new ways to cope with it and to deal with it. Um, Impaired self-control. So we really kind of associate self-control, impulse control, poor decision making with teenagers. And self-control and impulse control and executive functioning and thinking about the outcome and consequences of your actions really is something that is controlled by your brain. And when someone has a frontal lobe injury in particular, they might have changes in their ability to think about the consequences and long term with their actions. So knowing this and knowing that it's unintentional and a change that occurs in the brain can really help. It is something that can cause problems either in communicating or in the workplace or in relationships, and helping somebody to understand that's important. I think with sexual behavior and disinhibition, the important thing to understand is that when someone is sexually inappropriate, either with things that they say or the way that they may dress for a meeting or coming to something, for example, dressed inappropriately for the situation, like dressed for a night out, but coming to a serious business meeting. When these things happen, it's not necessarily anything that's meant to be aggressive or based on sexuality. It's really just an example of the disinhibition, similar to the impulse control that's controlled by the brain. So where their brain should have a filter saying, no, this is not appropriate for this time, they're working without that. Limited motivation and initiation. This would be when a person might look, especially a student in the classroom, to be lazy, to not be trying, to not care. And I think one of the ways that can best help someone like that is to acknowledge, I've noticed since your injury that you're having trouble with this big project or this big event that you're working on. Can I help you break it down? Break it down into smaller parts and sort of check in with them on the first steps and maybe having a little hands-on help with that first piece of getting started. Sometimes that initiation is just going to make it, that one piece they have to get over, that hurdle to start something. And intensification of pre-existing behaviors or disabilities. So it goes without saying that if somebody already is having trouble in one area, maybe they already are a procrastinator, maybe they already get upset easily, overstimulated by certain environments, that with the injury, working with an injured brain that might be experiencing lots of these changes and difficulties, that those might be exacerbated by the injury. And they might have some of those same problems after the injury that are intensified. Thank you very much.